I really think the Lost Caverns of Ixalan is one of the best sets we've had in recent times, and it's just because it's bringing so many new archetypes to a, I would say, pretty stale standard at this point. I think a lot of people are either not playing the format or are just, trying things and failing or just playing all the meta decks, but it's getting a little bit repetitive. We definitely need new archetypes to come in to reinvigorate the format, and I think this set will succeed at doing that. We have the dinos, we have the artifacts, we have a explorer, and we have the descend mechanic as well. So that's four new things attempting to come into the meta, and I think all of them will succeed. But today I want to showcase 10 of the cards I'm most looking forward to seeing in standard, and I think they are the best of what this set has to offer. Before we get into the gameplay, don't forget to click the subscribe button as well as the notification bell to keep up with my future uploads. Alright, let's jump right into it. First up, we have the Sentinel of the Nameless City, a 3-mana 3/4 with Vigilance. It's a Merfolk, Warrior, and Scout, which could matter, might also not matter, probably in Standard, but in other formats maybe. Anyways, 3/4 with Vigilance, enters the battlefield, makes a map token, and when it attacks, it also makes a map token, making this a reliable card on curve as you get the ETB effect to guarantee that value. It has a really good stat line, can become a 4/5, which is pretty key, I think, into most of the 3 drops that we have in Standard. Like, being able to attack with a 4/5 Vigilance is huge on turn 4, potentially. With the map token, which you can sack for 1, obviously, to explore, have a creature explore. And explore is, you look at the top card of your library, you reveal the top card of your library. If it's a land, you draw it, and if it's not a land, you get this creature gets +1/+1, and you can put it back on top, or you can put it in your graveyard. So it gives you that little bit of card selection and card advantage that is really good for the Explorer deck that has a lot of ways to gain value in the late game and has a lot of like really efficient early plays as well. So I just wanted to feature a card for the Explorer mechanic that was a creature here to highlight the strengths of the deck, and this card is definitely good. And moving right along, we have another card that will fit in the Explorer deck, certainly, Twists and Turns, which is a 1-mana enchantment. If a creature you control would explore, instead scry 1, and then that creature explores. So first of all, that gives you a lot of flexibility in the way you want to use your Explore. Sometimes you're going to want the +1/+1, so you want to set that up with the Scry. Sometimes you're going to want to draw a land, which you can set up with the Scry as well. This gives you like a lot of ways to manipulate Explore a little bit more to take advantage of the power of getting a +1/+1 counter early, or maybe if you really need that land, get that early as well. So it gives you a lot of consistency in a deck that I think definitely would need something like this, especially if it comes with additional effects like the second clause here, where when this enchantment enters the battlefield, target creature explores. So that means it's not only, something that's usable specifically on turn 1, like most of these static enchantments want to be seat play on turn 1, but this card, if you do draw it a little bit later in the game, it's not going to be terrible because you still get to have target creature explore. So it's still potentially giving, a +1/+1 counter for 1 mana, which is totally fine, or drawing you a land for 1 mana, which is also good. And it has an additional ability as well of when a land enters the battlefield under your control, if you control 7 or more, you can transform Twist and Turn. So it has a late game application as well. You're transforming it into a land that has a really solid activated ability, allowing you to fight in the late game as well. So you can pay 4 and tap this land, and you look at the top cards, top 4 cards of your library. You may reveal a creature from among those cards and put it into your hand, put the rest at the bottom. So you have flexibility, you have very good early game snowballing with this card, allowing you to like potentially push +1/+1 counters, and you've got the late game application of card advantage. This card pretty much does it all, and it's the thing that's going to tie the Explorer deck together, in my opinion. Next up, we have a card that is, maybe not going to see play, but I think the power is actually incredible in this card. And I would definitely not be surprised if a deck could take advantage of this and it'd be pushed directly into a tier 1 archetype. So let's take a look. 3 mana, legendary artifact. It has a tap ability where you draw a card then discard a card. So really good with like the descend mechanic, really good at like just in general. Looting is just very powerful in a card game, allowing you to consistently find what you'd want and potentially, leveraging the graveyard, etc. So it has bonuses on top of that. But that is not all this card can do. For 4 mana, and you have to tap this artifact, you can have this artifact transform, but you can only activate this if there are 4 more permanent types among cards in your graveyard. So you have to set up your deck in a specific way to have 4 different permanent types in your graveyard before you can activate this. And when you do, you get the core, which is absolutely busted. So the core is a land, and it taps for X amount of mana, where X is the number of permanent cards in your graveyard. So we know that to flip this, you have to have at least 4 permanents in your graveyard. So at the very least, this is going to tap for X equals 4 if you don't get graveyard hated, which is kind of the danger with this card. But again, if you're playing against a deck with graveyard hate, you can just leave this on the front side and it's still a totally reasonable card, honestly, especially if it's activating Descended and stuff like that. You know, you're getting a lot of value already. But if there's no graveyard hate, or if your opponent just didn't draw graveyard hate, this land will ramp you to ridiculous amounts of mana, essentially snowballing the game to levels that your opponent will almost never be able to keep up with as long as your deck is built correctly and is able to sustain your hand with card advantage. You'll just be pretty much gaining twice their mana per turn potentially if your deck is built correctly, which is absolutely ridiculous. So I think this card has a lot of potential. It might just be too hard to set up, and that's the risk, but I can see like the potential and the way this kind of breaks the flow of the game, where this is an incredibly dangerous card, and I think it's one to keep your eye on if you're looking at the set. Subterranean Schooner is a vehicle, and we have 2 vehicles, I think, in this set that are incredibly powerful, and this is definitely one of them. It's a blue vehicle, 2 mana for 3/4 crew 1, which is absolutely degenerate in terms of like efficiency, stat efficiency, crew efficiency. Like this thing is absolutely ridiculous. It is so easy to crew. The stat line is totally good for a 2-drop. And it has an additional ability on top of that. When it attacks, target creature that crewed it this turn explores. So you're scaling your creatures or drawing a land, so you either get a +1/+1 counter or a land, and card selection if you want to put that card in the graveyard. This card does it all, honestly. It is absolutely ridiculous for a 2-mana vehicle. I'm scared. I'm scared of this card. I'm gonna be honest. I think this is an incredibly dangerous card to have in standard, where the games are gonna snowball even faster than they already are, which is probably not a good thing. But yeah, this card definitely deserves its spot in the top 10 best cards in the set. And yeah, they'll probably see it around in the upcoming standard format. I'm gonna follow it up right away with another vehicle. This one is completely degenerate as well. Now, keep in mind, as all vehicles, especially late game, like mid game ones, I would say, like more expensive vehicles, they are at the mercy of, you know, getting removed for very cheap mana compared to the amount you cast to play them. Usually for half the price here for a 4 mana vehicle. So let's take a look. We have a 4 mana blue-red vehicle. It's a 5/5, which is totally good. And it has crew 3, which is really reasonable. Like crew 3 is probably where you want to be for like in relatively easy way to crew something. So crew 3 is where you want to be at, I think, for most vehicles at the most. And this is definitely warranted for the amount of power you're getting here. So you're getting a 5/5, and when it attacks, you create a treasure token, and until the end of turn, you can look at the top card of your library at any time, and you may play lands and cast spells from the top of your library. Now, this is completely absurd. So this card will ramp you with the treasure token, which is probably not warranted for a card like this. Kind of like Goldspan Dragony. But on top of that, it's going to give you access to the top of your deck to cast whatever you want, essentially giving you, if you're lucky, an incredible amount of card advantage. I mean, if you're unlucky, it's just 2 lands off the top. But in this deck, you probably want ways to manipulate the top of your library with like scrying and stuff like that. And this card just goes out of control completely. Like for turn 4, it is pretty early to have an effect like this, where the amount, first of all, you're attacking with a 5/5, and even if it trades, that's like totally fine, right? Because it's a static effect until end of turn, you can do something. So you're getting that treasure token, which is already crazy. The crew is relatively accessible, and on top of that, you can potentially cast like a bunch of, I don't know, if you have a bunch of burn off the top. I don't know what kind of deck is going to be using this. There's so many ways you can build it. Like you can just build a pure like cheap burn deck with like some cheap card draw as well. You can just play a regular mid-range deck with this card because it is a mid-range creature by itself, kind of as a 5/5. Like that's really strong stats, and it helps you ramp into potentially other mid-game threats. You can play this in an aggro deck to keep your, you know, your curve going. Like there's a lot of things, there's a lot of different directions, and I think that's what makes good cards even stronger. When you see the flexibility, like the endless options to play this in, That's very scary as a card. That is there's a ton of potential in this card, and for only 4 mana at that, like I think this card might be a little bit too cheap for the amount of value you're getting out of it, but it does have the downside or potential upside of being an artifact, depending on what deck it's in and what kind of answers we have in the format for like an expensive artifact. And there are quite a bit of answers, but are the decks going to be playing those answers? Well, we'll have to see. Next up, we have the premier 3-drop, the 3 mana 6/6 dinosaur. So, speaking of overstated, this thing is absolutely ridiculous stat line. It is completely degenerate, so you're expecting it to have some kind of static where it can't block or attack, right? Well, let's take a look here. So this creature, when it attacks, if you don't control another dino, you put a stun counter on it, which means it can block, and which means it can also attack even if you don't control another dino, but there's the downside of it not untapping the next turn. So this card essentially has no downside in the right deck, and even outside of dinosaur decks, you can still leverage it. It's absolutely bonkers. Like this card, I was looking at like something similar, like maybe what's that dinosaur that we had before, like the black one, the 7/6, where you discard a card on upkeep. Like that thing had a very real downside. This essentially is a no downside card, especially in a dino deck. There's almost no way that this is ever getting a stun counter on it. And if it is, you're doing it intentionally, which means like you're just attacking knowing it's going to get a stun counter. So it's probably like lethal or something. But otherwise, this thing's going to come down on turn 3. You're not going to be able to attack into it. And then it's just going to swing for 6 the next turn when you play another dino. Like, oh boy, this is definitely a card, and probably exactly what dinosaurs needed to become a relevant deck. Now, of course, it's still just a big creature, and we do have a lot of good removal spells, so it's not like that good. But 3 mana 6/6. What else could you possibly want? I don't know. Next up, we have the core creature for the artifact deck. And it's a 3 mana 1/5, which is absolutely ridiculous stat line for a defensive creature. One that will give you card advantage, as we'll see in a second. It's a legendary creature, Human Advisor. At the beginning of each player's end step, if an artifact entered the battlefield under your control this turn, look at the top 2 cards of your library, put one in your hand, the other in your graveyard. That is just insane. Like, if you think about it, that is incredibly powerful on an early game 3-drop. Especially in a deck that's going to be playing cheap artifacts, that's going to be built around, maybe built around this card specifically, maybe not, who cares? Like, this card is already good, even if you're activating its effect once during your turn and not even on your opponent's turn. But if there is a deck that can take advantage of flash artifacts, for example, you're potentially looking at the top 4 each turn, putting 2 in your hand and 2 in the graveyard. All of this is so good for the artifact deck. Craft, as a mechanic, will use artifacts in your graveyard to, transform a card, exile, transform a card. I don't really know how to explain it, but crafting essentially gives you a brand new artifact onto your battlefield potentially by feeding off of your graveyard, which is ideally. You can obviously craft with cards on your board as well, but you want to do it in the graveyard, which means it has a lot of value to put, permanents or artifacts into your graveyard. It can also fuel Descend if for whatever reason you're playing it with that. There's just there's so much value here, like drawing cards, setting up your graveyard for 3 mana 1/5. Your opponent's not going to be able to deal that much damage to you if they're facing down a 1/5 that doesn't die to cut down, that is going to have like a difficult time getting destroyed by mono red, for example. Like this card is a powerhouse, and especially if the deck is built like the way I'm kind of thinking about it, where it's just like a bunch of cheap flash artifacts for some reason. I think that's possible from what I've seen from the set. Like, maybe protection spells. Like, I don't know how the deck's gonna be built, but either way, even at its weakest, this card is insane, and at its strongest, it's like ridiculous. So that's yep, that is definitely gonna make the artifact deck a thing, in my opinion. Trumpeting Carnosaur is probably the most important dinosaur when it comes to rounding out the deck. It's a 6 mana 7/6 with trample, which is already like really solid for a dino deck. So it's going to have really good aggressive capabilities on the board with the trample with the 7 power. But it also has an ETB of discovering for 5. So to discover for 5, you're going to exile cards off the top of your library until you find a spell with mana value 5 or less, and then you get to cast that for free. So it's giving you card advantage, tempo, mana advantage by getting that spell cast for free. Sure, it's random, but usually as a dinosaur deck, all of your cards are going to be relevant on the board, so it's most likely going to get you another dino. But that's not all. This card also has the flexibility of acting as a removal spell. You can pay 3 mana and discard this card from your hand, and it deals 3 damage to target creature or planeswalker at instant speed. Planeswalker interaction, creature interaction, early game stabilizing, late game threat. It's so well rounded, it's ridiculous. And to tie things all together, we have an absolutely fantastic manland for the Dino deck and for just red green in general. I guess this card is just good. It's a dual land, so it comes in taps for red or green. For 4 mana, you can bring it out as a creature. It's going to be a dinosaur, which is relevant. And when it attacks another target attacking creature, gets +2/+0 until end of turn, and you get to untap that creature. So it's giving vigilance and +2/+0 to another creature that's attacking. I mean, that is super good. That is so solid, especially if most dinos are going to have like trample potentially, or if you have, especially on creatures with trample is what I'm saying. And even if they don't have trample, it's pretty much a free attack because you're going to be untapping that creature, so you have it on defense anyways. This land is really, really solid. Now, the one weakness is going to be that this stat line is not that good as a man land. Like 3/4 is not really where you want to be at. I think you'd rather have more power than toughness in a man land here, because if they have like a creature that can just, there's definitely possibilities with like 4/4s where you can't really attack into that no matter what. So you take the risk of potentially losing your manland for free. There's a lot of 4 power creatures that have more than 3 toughness, and that's the danger here. But still, a manland's a manland. It's still a really good land. So either way, you're getting the mana from it, and it just so happens to be, solid as well when it comes out in specific situations. And last, but certainly not least, I think this card is absolutely ridiculous. Thousand Moon Smithy is a legendary artifact for 4. I've already mentioned it in a previous spoiler video, but I cannot see how this card is not broken. I mean, okay, so enters the battlefield, you create a white gnome soldier artifact token with this creature's toughness and power are equal to the number of artifacts and or creatures you control. So you're getting a creature in a deck that is flooding the board with like artifacts that is going to be huge, that is also an artifact, so it will dodge things like Go for the Throat. It's going to be a huge defensive creature for only 4 mana. Sure, it can get removed, and if it gets removed, well, you still have this this artifact sticking on the battlefield. And the fact that it has an ETB effect that creates board presence means that if you have duplicates of this in your hand, you don't really care that much. You can easily just play the second one, get another gnome. Like, it's not a legendary artifact that you'll feel bad about having duplicates in your hand, as it's just going to create more board presence either way. But best case scenario, you're also going to be flipping this artifact at the beginning of your pre-combat main phase, so it can only transform the next turn at the earliest. You may tap 5 untapped artifacts and or creatures you control. If you do, you transform it into a land that adds white. And whenever you cast an artifact or creature spell using the mana produced by this land, you create a white gnome soldier artifact token with the same text as the flip side of this card. So essentially, you're going to be generating infinite amounts of gnome, soldier, artifacts, golem things. Is it a golem? It's not a golem. Anyways, you're just creating humongous creatures one after the other, infinitely. Like, this thing allows you to infinitely draw bombs, essentially. Every single artifact that you're going to be drawing off the top for the rest of the game, as long as this is in play, is going to generate a big creature. It is going to be relentless pressure for mid-range decks, against mid-range decks, against control decks, even against aggro decks. Like, I do not see a matchup for this card where you're unhappy having it in your deck, and that's why I think this card is absolutely busted. But yeah, anyways, that is going to do it for my top 10 best cards of the set. I hope you're as excited as I am. I'm going to be playing in the early access very soon. Going to be building out a few of these archetypes and, you know, seeing for myself if I'm actually wrong and I'm on some copium here that this set will impact the format. I'm really hoping it does, because otherwise I will be very disappointed. Anyways, I'll leave you with that. Hope you enjoyed this video. I'll see you on the next one. If you enjoy my content and would like to help me keep making it, consider supporting me over on Patreon, where you're going to access to a bunch of bonus videos, as well as other rewards depending on the tiers. And thank you so much to all the lovely patrons that are already subscribed. I appreciate it very much. And I will see you all in the next video.